On a quiet suburban street, early in the morning, a routine scene played out. General Marcus Davis, a black U.S. Army general, was driving alone, preparing for an important military event. His uniform was crisp, and his thoughts were focused on the duties ahead. His car rolled smoothly down the street, and the sun had just started to rise, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Everything seemed peaceful. But as the general approached an intersection, a police car suddenly flashed its lights behind him. Without hesitation, he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. As he had done countless times before in his life, he had always respected the law and understood the importance of being cooperative in situations like these. General Davis had served in the military for years, and he had been trained to stay calm in stressful situations. The officer, Ryan Parker, stepped out of his patrol car and approached General Davis's vehicle. The officer's demeanor was stern, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his side. General Davis greeted him with a firm, respectful nod and rolled down his window. "Good morning, officer," General Davis said in a calm, measured voice, his military training evident in the way he spoke. "Is there a problem, officer?" Officer Parker hesitated for a moment, then started his questioning. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" His voice was direct, but there was something in the way he asked that made the atmosphere tense. General Davis could feel it, a slight shift in the officer's attitude. It wasn't uncommon for people to be on edge during a traffic stop, but the officer's demeanor felt different, harsher. "No, officer," General Davis replied, still polite. "I'm on my way to a military event. I don't believe I was speeding or breaking any laws." The officer's expression hardened as he glanced at the general's car and then back at him. "I'll need you to step out of the vehicle," he said abruptly. General Davis, slightly taken aback, tried to stay calm. "I'm afraid that won't be necessary, officer. I'm not resisting in any way, but there's no reason for me to leave my car." It was a simple request, but the officer insisted. His tone became sharper, and the tension between them thickened. Officer Parker was growing impatient, and General Davis could feel the situation spiraling out of control. "I'm asking you to step out of the car." "Now," Officer Parker repeated, his voice growing more forceful. At this point, General Davis realized something was wrong. He had been pulled over countless times before, often in more stressful situations than this, but never had an officer demanded he step out of the car without a clear reason. His training kicked in. He was a high-ranking military officer who had dealt with many difficult situations, yet nothing in his experience prepared him for this. The general calmly raised his hands and spoke again. "I'm an Army general. Please understand, officer, I'm only asking to resolve this quickly and without any trouble." The officer, though, wasn't listening. His body language became more aggressive, and he motioned for the general to step out once more. But as he did, something in the officer's eyes, something unsettling, suggested he had already made up his mind. What should have been a simple interaction was rapidly turning into something far more dangerous. The situation was tense, and the officer's increasing hostility was undeniable. General Davis knew something had to be done before things escalated further, but in that moment, he couldn't have predicted just how much the officer's prejudice would influence what happened next. As General Davis calmly tried to de-escalate the situation, the officer's demands only grew more forceful. "Step out of the vehicle now," Officer Parker shouted, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and uncertainty. The general, though confused by the officer's sudden aggression, kept his composure. He knew the importance of staying level-headed in tense moments, especially given his military background. But nothing could have prepared him for the rapid escalation that followed. With a heavy sigh, General Davis slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, the tension in the air growing thicker with every second. The officer's hand was now resting firmly on his weapon, a clear sign that the situation had moved far beyond a simple traffic stop. As General Davis stepped out of his car, he tried to remain calm, even though his instincts told him something was wrong. "I'm a U.S. Army general," he said again, his voice steady. "There's no reason for this to go any further. Let's just talk." But Officer Parker didn't respond in the way the general had hoped. Instead of acknowledging the general's status, the officer took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. The general could see the flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of fear and aggression. But there was also something else, a subtle, unspoken judgment that made the general feel uneasy. It wasn't just about the situation anymore. Something deeper was at play. Suddenly, the officer lunged forward, his hand reaching for his gun. General Davis froze. He had faced danger in his military career, but this felt different. He instinctively raised his hands, trying to show he wasn't a threat. His mind raced. He had been trained for combat, for managing tense situations, but never had he experienced one so charged with hostility for reasons that had nothing to do with his actions. The officer's voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't move." In that split second, everything seemed to slow down. The general, still with his hands raised, glanced at the officer's shaking hands and saw the gun in his holster. His military training kicked in, and he knew this was a dangerous moment. The officer was clearly rattled, but what happened next was even more shocking. Without warning, Officer Parker pulled out his weapon, pointing it directly at the general. It all happened so fast that General Davis didn't have time to react. The officer's fingers squeezed the trigger, and a single gunshot rang out through the still morning air. The force of the bullet sent General Davis stumbling backward, his body crumpling to the ground as a searing pain erupted in his chest. His vision blurred, and he could feel the blood pooling beneath him. The world around him seemed to close in, the sounds of the officer shouting growing distant as his own breathing became more shallow. The officer stood over him, frozen in shock. The general, struggling to stay conscious, managed to whisper, "Why?" But Officer Parker didn't answer. Instead, he stood there, paralyzed by the realization of what he had just done. It wasn't just the sound of the gunshot that echoed in the general's ears. It was the sheer disbelief of what had just unfolded. The officer had acted out of fear, out of something deeper that had been brewing in his mind for much longer than anyone could have imagined. As the seconds ticked by, General Davis' world began to fade. His last thoughts were of the injustice, of how a simple misunderstanding, fueled by something far darker, had taken his life. And as he slipped into unconsciousness, one thing became clear: what happened next would shock the world. The gunshot that had taken General Marcus Davis's life was heard across the neighborhood. In the moments following the tragedy, time seemed to stop. Officer Parker stood frozen, his gun still aimed at the general, his body rigid with shock. He hadn't fully grasped what he had just done. For a moment, there was silence, thick, suffocating silence, before the world around him started to rush back. A civilian who had been driving nearby had pulled over at the sound of the gunshot. From behind the safety of their car, they watched in disbelief as the officer stood there, the gun still in his hand, while General Davis lay motionless on the ground. The civilian quickly grabbed their phone, starting to record, knowing that this was a moment that needed to be captured. Panic set in for Officer Parker. He dropped his gun to the ground and immediately crouched down beside the general, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. There was none. General Davis was gone. His mind raced, but the reality of what had just unfolded seemed impossible to process. He had never intended to kill the man, but the moment of fear and the instant decision to pull the trigger had sealed the fate of an innocent person. The civilian, still recording, called 911 in a shaky voice, telling them about the officer involved in the shooting and the lifeless body on the ground. In a matter of moments, sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder as they approached the scene. People started to gather, drawn to the chaos that had just unfolded in their quiet community. As the first responders arrived, they quickly assessed the situation. They began to take control of the scene, but the shock of it all lingered in the air. The officer was placed under arrest, his hands cuffed as he was led away. But the public was not satisfied with simply seeing the arrest. The questions immediately started. Why had it happened? Why had the officer escalated the situation so quickly? What was behind the officer's actions? News spread like wildfire. The incident wasn't just a tragic loss of life. It was an example of something much bigger, something that had been festering beneath the surface for years. General Marcus Davis wasn't just any person. He was a highly respected U.S. Army general, someone who had dedicated his life to serving his country. The idea that a man like him could be treated like this, especially when there was no need for it, shocked everyone. People everywhere were asking the same question. Why? The pain of his death wasn't just felt by his family. It reverberated through the military community, and it quickly became clear that this was not just another case of police misconduct. It was a breaking point. The outrage was immediate, and the call for justice grew louder. Protests began to form in different cities. People of all backgrounds, races, and creeds came together to demand accountability. They were united by a single, unshakable belief. What happened that morning was wrong, and it could not go unanswered. It wasn't just the shocking nature of the shooting that fueled the fire. It was the undeniable sense of injustice. People knew that this wasn't just about a tragic accident. It was a problem that ran deep, and the consequences of this officer's actions could no longer be ignored. In the days that followed, the media spotlight on the case only grew brighter. News stations, social media platforms, and communities across the nation were buzzing with conversation. The story of General Davis's tragic death wasn't just a headline. It became a symbol of a broken system, and of the need for change. What happened next was something no one could have predicted, but it was clear that it would shake the country to its core. In the days following General Marcus Davis's death, the country was engulfed in a wave of emotions. Anger, confusion, and sadness poured out from communities all over the United States. His tragic death had sparked something that no one could have predicted: a nationwide conversation about race, justice, and the accountability of law enforcement. People were demanding answers, and the question on everyone's lips was, how could this happen? The first steps toward finding justice began with an investigation into the shooting. Officer Ryan Parker was immediately placed on administrative leave while the police department conducted its inquiry into the incident. Many assumed that the case would be handled quietly, as many others had been before it. But this time, the public's response was different. People weren't willing to let this case slip through the cracks. The public pressure was immense, and everyone was watching closely. The investigation was fast-tracked, and it wasn't long before it became clear that there were issues beyond the tragic shooting itself. People began digging into Officer Parker's background, and what they found was shocking. It wasn't just the fact that he had made a deadly mistake that day. It was the troubling pattern of behavior that had been overlooked for years. Officer Parker had a history of complaints about racial profiling. He had been involved in several other incidents where his actions had been questioned, but each time, those cases had been dismissed or swept under the rug. Internal investigations had been closed without any meaningful consequences. As more details of his past came to light, it became apparent that the officer had been allowed to continue his work without being held accountable for his previous misconduct. For many, this revelation was a turning point. It wasn't just about the death of one man. It was about a larger issue within the system. How many times had incidents like this been ignored? How many times had law enforcement been allowed to operate with impunity without any real checks on their behavior? The public's outcry for justice grew louder, and with it, the calls for police reform reached new heights. The media played a crucial role in keeping the story alive. News outlets picked up the story, and the case quickly became a focal point of national discussions. The footage of the tragic shooting, captured by a civilian bystander, was shown on every major news network. It was a stark reminder of what had happened, and as the video spread across social media, the public's outrage only intensified. People shared their thoughts, opinions, and emotions online, and the hashtag #JusticeForDavis began trending across the country. Even as the investigation continued, There was a growing sense of disbelief. How had things gotten so bad? The public was demanding accountability not just from Officer Parker, but from the entire police force. The tragic death of General Davis had ignited a fire that no one could extinguish. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about the deep-rooted issues within the police system that allowed such incidents to happen over and over again. As protests filled the streets, people stood together, united in their grief and anger. They weren't just protesting the death of one man. They were protesting the countless lives lost due to systemic issues in law enforcement. The general's death had become a catalyst for change, and the country was on the edge of something big. The calls for justice were impossible to ignore, and no one knew exactly what would happen next. But everyone knew that things would never be the same again. As the days passed and the pressure for justice mounted, the investigation into Officer Ryan Parker's actions began to unfold in a way that many had not anticipated. The public, already furious over the tragic death of General Marcus Davis, now had a growing sense of disbelief as more details came to light. It wasn't just about the shooting itself. It was about the system that allowed such incidents to happen again and again. The investigation took on a more serious tone when it was revealed that Officer Parker had a troubling history. Internal records showed that the officer had been involved in several other incidents where his actions had been questioned. Incidents that involved racial bias, excessive force, and poor judgment. Complaints had been filed against him before, but each time they were dismissed or quietly swept under the rug. It became clear that there had been a failure within the police department to properly investigate and address these concerns. What made the situation even more troubling was that Officer Parker's past was not an isolated case. His record was not an outlier. It was part of a much larger pattern of behavior within the force. The more the investigation dug into his background, the more it became apparent that the department had failed to hold him accountable for years. Instead of taking action when warnings had been issued, the department had allowed him to continue his work unchecked. It was a pattern of neglect that was far too common in law enforcement. The revelations were shocking, but they were not entirely surprising. For many people, this was a painful reminder of how often incidents like this were allowed to slip through the cracks. Officer Parker's actions were part of a bigger issue, a problem that went beyond just one officer or one incident. The system, many argued, was broken, and General Davis's death was a stark example of that. As the investigation continued, public outcry grew even stronger. People were demanding not only justice for General Davis, but also a reckoning for the way law enforcement had handled the situation. Protesters gathered in cities across the country, calling for accountability and reform. The tragic death of the general had sparked a movement, one that pushed for systemic change in the way police forces operated. It was no longer enough to simply address individual cases of misconduct. People were now demanding that the entire system be examined and reformed. In the midst of all this, the media continued to shine a spotlight on the case. News outlets and social media platforms were flooded with stories about Officer Parker's past and the growing calls for justice. The video of the shooting, which had been recorded by a civilian, continued to circulate, serving as a painful reminder of the injustice that had taken place. The public had seen the truth for themselves, and now there was no turning back. What followed was a surge of public awareness about the deeper issues within law enforcement. People were talking about racial profiling, police brutality, and the need for accountability in a way they never had before. The story of General Davis's death had become a symbol of the larger fight for justice, and it was clear that the conversation was only just beginning. As the investigation moved forward, the country was on edge, waiting for answers. Everyone knew that what happened next would set the stage for something much larger than just one case. The calls for reform were growing louder, and the pressure on lawmakers and law enforcement agencies was undeniable. Something had to change, and the tragic death of General Marcus Davis had made that crystal clear. As the investigation into Officer Ryan Parker's actions moved toward the courtroom, the entire nation held its breath. The tragic death of General Marcus Davis had shaken the country to its core, and now, the question on everyone's mind was whether justice would truly be served. The atmosphere was tense as it became clear that this case wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was a reflection of the deeper issues within law enforcement and the broader societal problems that had been ignored for far too long. The trial was set to begin, and the media couldn't get enough of it. News outlets, social media, and even ordinary citizens were watching closely, eager to see how the judicial system would handle this high-profile case. The world was watching, waiting to see if Officer Parker would be held accountable for his actions. But it wasn't just about the trial itself. It was about what this trial represented. This was no longer just the case of one officer who had made a tragic mistake. This trial had become a symbol for the fight for justice, accountability, and police reform. The defense team for Officer Parker argued that the officer had acted out of fear and self-defense. They claimed that when the general made a move toward him, the officer thought he was in immediate danger, prompting him to use his weapon. The defense emphasized that the officer's actions were a result of the split-second decisions that police officers often had to make in dangerous situations. They painted Officer Parker as a man who had been put in an impossible situation, one where his fear had led him to make a tragic, but not intentional, mistake. On the other side, the prosecution painted a very different picture. They highlighted the officer's history of complaints and misconduct, pointing out that he had been involved in several previous incidents where his actions had been questioned. The prosecution argued that Officer Parker's history of racial bias and his tendency to escalate situations played a crucial role in the tragic death of General Davis. They brought up the civilian footage of the incident, showing the officer's behavior in real time and arguing that the officer's decision to pull his weapon and shoot the general was not a reflex action, but a result of a deeper, more troubling issue. The courtroom drama was intense. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, presenting evidence of the officer's past behavior and trying to show that his actions on the day of the shooting were not a result of a tragic misunderstanding, but rather the result of a pattern of bias and poor decision-making. They painted a picture of a man who had not only failed to serve and protect, but had, instead, acted out of fear and prejudice. As the trial continued, the emotional toll on the families involved was evident. General Davis's family sat in a courtroom, devastated by the loss of their loved one. His wife, children, and extended family members had to relive the horror of that fateful day with every piece of evidence presented. But they knew that this was bigger than just their personal loss. It was about making sure that the same thing didn't happen to anyone else. They were fighting not only for justice for the general, but for a future where incidents like this no longer occurred. Officer Parker's family, too, was torn apart. They watched as the officer's past was brought into the light, and the truth about his previous actions was revealed. It was clear that they loved him, but they too understood that the situation had spiraled out of control, and now they faced the harsh reality of what that meant. The trial seemed to go on forever, with witnesses called, experts brought in, and emotional testimony from both sides. But one thing became increasingly clear. The case was not just about Officer Parker. It was about a larger issue, one that transcended this specific incident. The trial had turned into a national conversation about police conduct, race relations, and the need for significant reform within law enforcement. People weren't just watching to see if justice would be served for General Davis. They were watching to see if the system itself would change. Would the judicial system hold the officer accountable for his actions? Would it finally acknowledge the patterns of injustice that had been allowed to persist for too long? The nation waited anxiously as the trial came to a close, knowing that whatever the outcome, it would send a powerful message about the future of justice in the country. The verdict in Officer Ryan Parker's trial was a turning point, but it was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey for the country. The death of General Marcus Davis had sparked a national conversation, and with the guilty verdict now in place, the public knew that justice had been served in one case. But the question that loomed large was whether this case would be the catalyst for real, lasting change. Across the country, people took to the streets in the days following the trial's conclusion. Some celebrated the verdict, feeling a sense of relief that the officer had been held accountable. Others, however, knew that the fight wasn't over. The death of General Davis had been a tragic reminder of the racial tensions and systemic issues that existed in law enforcement. It wasn't enough to just punish one officer. The entire system needed to be reformed. Protesters called for changes to police practices, for greater accountability within law enforcement agencies, and for stronger measures to address racial bias in policing. The case had brought these issues into the public eye in a way that hadn't been done before, and people were demanding action. The protests were peaceful but passionate, with people of all races, ages, and backgrounds standing together to demand a better future. At the same time, lawmakers began to feel the pressure. They could no longer ignore the growing movement for police reform. Bills were introduced in state and federal legislatures to address issues such as police transparency, the use of force, and racial profiling. The goal was not just to prevent tragedies like the one that claimed General Davis's life, but to build a system that was truly fair and just for everyone. The media continued to cover the story, keeping the pressure on both law enforcement and politicians. News outlets broadcasted interviews with experts, community leaders, and everyday people who had been affected by the tragic events. Social media became a powerful tool for spreading awareness and mobilizing people across the country. The hashtag Justice for Davis became a symbol of the larger movement for change, one that called for accountability, fairness, and equality. For General Davis's family, the fight for justice was not over. While the verdict had brought some sense of closure, they knew that their loved one could never be replaced. His death had left an irreplaceable void in their lives, but they were determined to ensure that his legacy lived on. They became vocal advocates for police reform, speaking at rallies and sharing their story with anyone who would listen. Their pain was deep, but their commitment to making a difference was even stronger. The ripple effects of General Davis's death were felt in many different ways. In communities across the country, conversations began to shift. People started to ask difficult questions about race, power, and privilege. They began to examine how systems of power had shaped their lives and the lives of others. The country was at a crossroads, and the choices made in the aftermath of General Davis's death would determine the future. As the months passed, small but meaningful changes started to take place. Some police departments began to implement new policies to increase transparency and accountability. Others began to invest in training programs aimed at addressing racial bias and improving community relations. It was clear that change would not come overnight, but the momentum that had been built in the wake of General Davis's death was undeniable. The story of his death, the trial, and the aftermath was a painful chapter in the country's history, but it was also a turning point. It had forced the nation to confront its flaws and to take a hard look at the systems that governed its institutions. It had ignited a movement for justice, one that had touched the lives of millions, and that would continue to shape the future. While the fight for change was far from over, the story of General Marcus Davis had proven something important, that even in the face of tragedy, people had the power to demand change and make a difference. And in the end, that was the most powerful legacy of all. The verdict in Officer Ryan Parker's trial was a turning point, but it was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey for the country. The death of General Marcus Davis had sparked a national conversation, and with the guilty verdict now in place, the public knew that justice had been served in one case. But the question that loomed large was whether this case would be the catalyst for real, lasting change. Across the country, people took to the streets in the days following the trial's conclusion. Some celebrated the verdict, feeling a sense of relief that the officer had been held accountable. Others, however, knew that the fight wasn't over. The death of General Davis had been a tragic reminder of the racial tensions and systemic issues that existed in law enforcement. It wasn't enough to just punish one officer. The entire system needed to be reformed. Protesters called for changes to police practices, for greater accountability within law enforcement agencies, and for stronger measures to address racial bias in policing. The case had brought these issues into the public eye in a way that hadn't been done before, and people were demanding action. The protests were peaceful but passionate, with people of all races, ages, and backgrounds standing together to demand a better future. At the same time, lawmakers began to feel the pressure. They could no longer ignore the growing movement for police reform. Bills were introduced in state and federal legislatures to address issues such as police transparency, the use of force, and racial profiling. The goal was not just to prevent tragedies like the one that claimed General Davis's life, but to build a system that was truly fair and just for everyone. The media continued to cover the story, keeping the pressure on both law enforcement and politicians. News outlets broadcasted interviews with experts, community leaders, and everyday people who had been affected by the tragic events. Social media became a powerful tool for spreading awareness and mobilizing people across the country. The hashtag Justice for Davis became a symbol of the larger movement for change, one that called for accountability, fairness, and equality. For General Davis's family, the fight for justice was not over. While the verdict had brought some sense of closure, they knew that their loved one could never be replaced. His death had left an irreplaceable void in their lives, but they were determined to ensure that his legacy lived on. They became vocal advocates for police reform, speaking at rallies and sharing their story with anyone who would listen. Their pain was deep, but their commitment to making a difference was even stronger. The ripple effects of General Davis's death were felt in many different ways. In communities across the country, conversations began to shift. People started to ask difficult questions about race, power, and privilege. They began to examine how systems of power had shaped their lives and the lives of others. The country was at a crossroads, and the choices made in the aftermath of General Davis's death would determine the future. As the months passed, small but meaningful changes started to take place. Some police departments began to implement new policies to increase transparency and accountability. Others began to invest in training programs aimed at addressing racial bias and improving community relations. It was clear that change would not come overnight, but the momentum that had been built in the wake of General Davis's death was undeniable. The story of his death, the trial, and the aftermath was a painful chapter in the country's history, but it was also a turning point. It had forced the nation to confront its flaws and to take a hard look at the systems that governed its institutions. It had ignited a movement for justice, one that had touched the lives of millions, and that would continue to shape the future. While the fight for change was far from over, the story of General Marcus Davis had proven something important, that even in the face of tragedy, people had the power to demand change and make a difference. And in the end, that was the most powerful legacy of all.